Pops Cones. This one's a fun one. I did these readings like 3 weeks ago, so apologies if I'm a little slow on the tick here, or if I have to make a couple corrections as I remember the cases just a little better. A reminder: these are not scripted. If you haven't noticed, this is just me basically reading from my notes as a little video diary. If it helps you, that's great. If it doesn't help you, well, that's okay. This isn't for you. This is mostly for me. So, we're looking at Pops Cone versus Resorts International Hotel Incorporated. Here's how Pops Cones goes. Basically, Pops Cones is he's a franchisee of thank God it's yogurt. Thank Christ for yogurt. I don't know. Some yogurt company. He sells yogurt. And Resorts comes to him, Resorts International Hotel, which, what is it with companies and having names that mean nothing? Anyway, so Pops Cones, he's sitting there, and they come and they say, hey, we want you to come and open your store inside our casino, or a resort. I think it was a casino. And the negotiations are undertaken, but ultimately the resort ends up rejecting the contract. But he'd been told repeatedly they would accept, to the point where he had relied on that contract, where he had said, okay, well, I'm going to close down my business. I'm not going to re-sign my lease. I'm going to, get ready to move in. And he did. And, right? And there was originally going to be a summary judgment for the resort, but the court ends up saying, no summary judgment here. Why? Because a promise doesn't need to have all its terms laid out to be reasonable to rely on, right? It needs to be left to a jury whether or not reliance is reasonable. So what are the 4 parts of promissory estoppel? Promise, expected reliance, injustice. 2 and 3 can be combined in like 90% of cases. They're 2 different fact sets, but really, to a normal person, most of the time, it's harder to make that distinction. So what is number 1? Promise. Hey, we promise you can move into this spot in our hotel. 2, reasonable reliance. This part maybe wasn't met. Well, the court originally says this part wasn't met. And then the higher court says, no, this part was met. They made a promise. So sure, it's not a super definitive promise, but it's a promise. It's definitive enough. The second part of the promise was reliance. There was the reasonability of reliance. Reasonable of expected, yada, yada, yada. Sorry. Expectation of reliance. Reasonable reliance is here, but also reasonable expectation. So, there was a reasonable expectation. Everyone can agree that. If there was a promise, and they made a pretty clear, open promise, it's reasonable. They expected him to rely on it. They expected him to move in until they canceled the, negotiations. Third, big one, reliance. And if it's reasonable, this is the question they're asking here is, that's the court saying, no, it's time for a jury to say, was it reasonable for him to rely on the sort of promise you had made? Sort of contract you had put out, however you want to phrase it. It's kind of hard because you're in a pseudo non-contract contract world, but it's a promise. The court says it's a promise, or at least close enough to a promise to be reasonable to count as a promise. And then the injustice. The injustice was, pretty obvious. He had lost months worth of income, and he'd lost his lease. He didn't have anywhere to do business, which is extremely expensive. So those 4 parts are those are the 4 parts of promissory estoppel. And so the court says, okay, all right, you need to have a jury decide. You can't summary judgment on this because there's a promise, because they expected him to rely on it. There was an injustice, and there was some reliance. We need to know if it's reasonable. Reliance has to be reasonable. That's basically what's one thing here is there's two basic rules being pointed out in Pops Cones. One is that a promise doesn't need to be definitive, and that the jury needs to determine if the reliance was reasonable. Reasonable reliance is what is reliance.